Let's have our next two discussants make presentations first, and then we'll have everybody come up to the front here and have a generalized discussion, okay? Our next speaker, our discussant really, is somebody who I just met today, but of course I knew by reputation for a long time. And I did not realize that her name was Mighty, Mighty, Mighty Monica White, but I did learn that today. So, Monica White is a faculty member in Environmental Justice Program of the Gaylord Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies in the Department of Community and Environmental Sociology. Her research engages communities of color and grassroots organizations that are involved in the development of sustainable community food systems as a strategy to respond to issues of hunger and food inaccessibility. So, Monica, you want to come here and let's work this out together, okay? I think we escaped this first, right? So how do we get to you? Remember? We got to get the help. There we go.
All right. So I didn't do what I was supposed to do, but hope that you will enjoy my comments. Oops, sorry. So I thought that being a public discussant and the work that I do in terms of communities meant to sort of contextualize the work of what's going on in Detroit and right up the street to that which we're talking about in the academy. So my title was Freedom Farms and Movable Schools, Black Roots of Food Sovereignty, Fannie Lou Hamer and George Washington Carver. Before I get started, I would like to recognize, I feel like I'm at the Grammys, and I'm an up and coming, and all these academics whose work I have cited forever are in the audience. So I want to just sort of acknowledge that part. But I also want to take a moment to recognize the activists in the room. Could you wave, or if you're able, stand? The activists who are from Detroit and other places on the ground, right? So thank you for, we do this all the time. Academics, we sit for hours and have conversation. And for activists who are used to and accustomed to doing work, I am grateful that you took the time out of your schedule to come and sort of listen to us talk about the work that you are doing. I need you to know, activists, that my very life exists because of you. Any work that I do is a love letter to you. The origins, the essence, and the implications of my work are because of who you are, because you took me under your wing, because you taught me, and I am grateful. And so it is with this lens that I think it's really important for us to think about the semiotic relationship between activists and academics. What can we learn? Oh, thank you. So there's a semiotic relationship. So I think Malik's comments that there's some newness about this is absolutely accurate, but I also think that there are historical roots to understanding the work that communities are doing and that academics have done, and I would like for us to pay homage to that. And the reason that I say that I start with the Black roots of food sovereignty is because, as Walter Rodney, how Africa underdeveloped how Europe underdeveloped Africa. I think that if we don't talk about Black folks and the contributions of Black farmers and the labor and the resources that we all benefit from at the expense of the continent of Africa, then we really do a disservice to those who have gone before us. And I think what's also important is that a lot of us are talking about contemporary issues, and I like to take us back and to look at the fact that this isn't new, right? So when people say, oh yeah, tell us about this new community movement, I'm like, dude, this ain't new. As long as there have been people in cities, people have grown food. There may be some new things, new nuances, and some new ideas around it, but I really want us to think about the semiotic relationship between activists and academics and those of us who consider ourselves both. I usually start my work off by sort of paying homage to and honoring the work of my dad, Dr. Maurice White, who, as an academic, did a lot of work at Wayne State University, specialized in educational psychology, but as a father and as a community member, he told me how you bring it all in, how your work in the classroom is not different than your work in the community, which is not different than your work in the home. And so this is him in Buckley, Michigan, near Traverse City on the land. He taught me the importance of agriculture, the importance of food as community, and the importance of making your work relevant. So, in talking about the Black roots of food sovereignty, you can't do this without sort of talking about the key theorists and those who've gone before in terms of understanding the centrality of agriculture for the Black community. Now, I want these comments to be relevant for all kinds of communities. So there are the Latino roots, the Chicano roots, there are the European roots, like everybody has a root of food sovereignty. So take this as one example, apply it to your own work. But really this work is to give community folks, especially Detroiters that are under siege, a bit of love and a bit of encouragement and a few lessons that history can teach us. So I sort of see myself as this person that straddles a lot of fences, right? So I'm a sociologist who's also a historian. I'm an academic who's also an activist. And the work that I do connects urban to rural, elders to youth, and cities and south and north, right? And so in all this, it sounds like I'm busy. Really super busy, but I want you all to just sort of go with me just to sort of briefly. Booker T. Washington started Tuskegee Institute, committed to agriculture and did a tremendous amount of work. In the book, I sort of talk about the work that he did at Tuskegee, and people don't know that students, graduates from Tuskegee went to their respective homes and then created other Tuskegee-like institutions, and in those places, that's where they had the largest Black land ownership in those counties. So people don't know. I mean, people sort of reduce them to, you know, just a few things, cast your buckets where they lay in an argument. But I do think that there's an essence of understanding what he was able to do and why this scholarship was so important to making sure that Black folk were connected to the land and were able to be self-sufficient and self-determined. We also have Du Bois. I'll read a quote, especially for those of us in the city that are working on cooperatives. Du Bois says, "There exists today a chance for the Negroes to organize a cooperative state within their own group. By letting Negro farmers feed Negro artisans and Negro technicians guide Negro home industries and Negro thinkers plan this integration of cooperation, while Negro artists dramatize the beauty and beautify the struggle, economic independence can be achieved. To doubt this is possible is to doubt the essential humanity and quality of brains of the American Negro." And so when we say cooperatives, we talk about, and Dr. Nimhart's work talks about cooperatives as an economic struggle, as an economic strategy. My work sort of talks about it as a resistance strategy. And the resurgence of cooperatives and the language that you hear in the current food movement, we have some beautiful, valuable lessons of those who have gone before us. George Washington Carver, I am a fan. I'm going to talk a little bit about what he did to give us some ideas of, as academics, of the roles that we should be playing and the ways that our scholarship should be applied, useful, and rooted in the experiences of communities and those who suffer from food insecurity or whatever the conditions, the social conditions are. And of course, I can't do this with all men. Got to have my girl, Fannie Lou Hamer, on here. I'm going to talk briefly about the work that she did with Freedom Farms Agricultural Cooperative. What's essential to understand in the case of Freedom Farms Agricultural Cooperative is that if you think about the time when Fannie Lou Hamer started Freedom Farms, I'm getting ahead of myself, so let me just go on and just go here. So George Washington Carver said there's probably no subject more important than the study of food. Here we are talking about food and trying to figure out how this fits, but I'm going to tell you why I'm in love with him. So many reasons that I'm in love with him. There are some who really focus on the conversation around the soybean and peanuts, but really, if you think about him, Rafi Zafir just wrote a piece for Common Grounds where she talks about him as sort of the founder of the Farm to Fork movement. Is the new piece that just came out, and really just sort of talking about his scholarship in that regard. We can talk about him as the father of recycling. He was the original dumpster diver at Tuskegee without lots of resources. He'd go over to Auburn and go through the dumpsters to say, hey, this is a perfectly good Bunsen burner. Why can't we use this? In addition to all the different ways in which he made sure that his work was relevant for communities. So I talk about his work because this is what he did at the university, right? He did all kinds of, he's a botanist, he did all kinds of experiments in the laboratory, but his work didn't start there. So for the students who were able to sort of benefit from his expertise, There was lots that they had learned in the laboratory, but then he took them outside. He said, okay, well, that's one thing. Here, let's go outside and see what this is. People were fascinated by his knowledge of everything agricultural. Like, he was a student of the environment and made sure that he made information that he learned, like he was passionate about it. Like, he was driven by this, driven so much that the blinds were drawn on his laboratory because he didn't want people to know how much time he was actually spending on his work. He did scholarship and work on purslane and lamb's quarter and all the conversations that we're having now about what's growing between the cracks of the concrete is actually some nutritional dandelion greens and how to use and benefit that. And then said, okay, so it's not enough that we have students in the classroom and out in the lab, but we also have to take the material. We don't have to ask the farmers to come to us. We can take the material to the farmers, to the growers. And so, like, the movable school came to town, folks were dressed up in their Sunday finest. This was not just oh, let's come talk about. No, people were sharp. They were really seriously interested. And it wasn't just a one-sided relationship. It wasn't just a, hey, let us show you what we found in the lab, but really, what are your issues? What are your concerns? How can I support you? You know that the doors of the university are open, and so we want to make sure that there's a symbiotic relationship between the community and the university. Help for Hard Times, this is actually available online. In his pamphlets, he did a series of pamphlets that are available. And this is all relevant today. So he talks about the proper time to plant certain things, how you can do value-added products from your farm, what do you need to grow, how do you rotate your crops. This is why we call him the father of sustainable agriculture. All kinds of valuable information. Here's what we need to know. Okay, I see you. And made sure that this was important. He has a children's curriculum that he wrote for teaching ag in schools, stuff we don't even know about. So Fannie Lou Hamer testifies before the Democratic Congress and demanding that the Mississippi Freedom voters be selected. After the Voting Rights Act, she returns home and starts Freedom Farm Agricultural Cooperative, 680 acres in Ruleville, Mississippi. They had a medical mobile unit. They had commercial kitchens. They used the phrase community gardens, and the land that was used for the market gardens, the money that was made from that was then sent to pay for the other land, make the land payments. They had, so let's take some, I want you just to listen to this real quick. And I tell you that Fannie Lou speaks to me. When you hear this, you'll know what I mean.
Then we are in the South because we know where we stand. And a lot of you don't. You know, some of you get a few degrees, a pretty good house, and a bill you can't hardly pay, trying to live like somebody else, and think you have arrived. But honey, regardless of how you feel, we are in this bag together. And there's nobody at the University of Wisconsin and no other place in this country is free until I'm free in the South.
So the symbiotic relationship between the academy and, I'm arguing that, you know, Fannie Lou, and even though they never knew each other, times were totally different, that there's a symbiotic relationship that exists between all of us in this room, and that our freedom is connected to each other's. So just brilliant. She had 6 seasons of education, which wasn't even a 6th grade education. It just meant between the growing season. But here she articulates hunger as oppression. Nobody told us we have to move from Mississippi. Nobody tells us we're not wanted, but when we're starving, you know. Where a couple of years ago, white people were shooting at Negroes trying to register. Now they say, go ahead and register and then you'll starve. Down in Mississippi, they're killing Negroes of all ages on the installment plan through starvation. If you're a Negro and vote, if you persist in your dreams of black power to win some measure of freedom in a white-controlled counties, you go hungry. There's a way to fight against the nonviolent weapon of officialdom. Her vision was Freedom Farms Agricultural Cooperative. Here's the first payment on the first 40 acres. Here's Fannie Lou on the farm. Here is the market, the Freedom Farms market, the cooperative market. 10% of the proceeds from the community garden went into the food bank, and that was then spent and shared amongst those who weren't able to work, who were not, quote, members, although membership was pretty loose. They started with a pig bank, the first heifer project in the US. They called them the sunflower pigs. They were celebrities. So with 45 pigs, you would get a pregnant sow, and then you would have, once they had delivered, you kept the babies and put 2 back in the bank so that other families would be able to, right? And so this idea was this sort of communal sharing and this, these you can't see very well, but it's a sewing cooperative. And so the women would make clothes and the proceeds would be shared collectively. They had a catfish cooperative, which is the source of, the beginning of what we see now is this huge catfish industry in places like Mississippi, and they had a tool bank. All the tools were shared, all the resources were shared. These were some of the tractors that were sent. This is the housing development. They had acres, 100 acres dedicated to a housing development. Some of those homes are still standing. And she talks about what it was like to stand outside and to listen to the folks who came in from, who had lived in shanties that were on the plantations and had now had homes. And they talked about, wow, I didn't even realize it was cold out here. You know, when I was growing up, you always knew how cold it was because it was as cold inside as it was outside. And so this idea of collective agency and community resilience, I'm asking for those of us who are either academics or activists or somewhere in between, that we recognize that people have solutions and ideas for how to respond. Resilience I love because I think it really sort of captures how do we adapt in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, and stress, and not focus on that part of it, but focus on the community building as resistance, concentrating on how do we respond, how do we create a different reality. And so, if we argue that that is resistance, what is this resistance? Can this be? A friend of mine, when I get stuck, he always says, what's your superpower? And I'm like, roar. So is growing food our superpower? Is organizing our superpower? Is this resistance? Can this be resistance? Can that be? And so I'm asking this in the same sense that we say that Black Lives Matter. If Black Lives Matter, then so do, to create a food system, as Eric says, where Black Lives Matter is to talk and to think about a liberated food system, then I would argue that this is important because here can be our superheroes. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Monica. Woo! I agree. Our final discussant now is Eric Holt-Giménez. Eric is currently Executive Director of Food First, and he discussed Food First a little bit before when he got up to tell you a little bit about it. Eric's actually quite famous for his groundbreaking work on farmer-to-farmer agroecological research and development, originally done in Nicaragua. He also has a marvelous, marvelous piece on a agroecological, I want to say resistance, but not really resistance, resilience to hurricane force winds and I could, what's that?
Hurricane Mitch.
From Hurricane Mitch, exactly, in Central America. So, Eric?
You can close it and
put this one on top, okay. Well, I don't know, Monica just took my breath away, so I don't follow that. First of all, I want to thank everybody for being here. I want to thank you for your good work. I want to thank you for your goodwill. I've felt like this has been a really a comradely gathering, and I think that's exactly what we need. So, I mean, as a discussant, it's impossible for me to synthesize what's gone down before, just even in this, the 4 speakers who came before me, and certainly what's happened all today. But it has helped me to reflect on some things, and so I'm going to share those reflections and maybe a couple of provocative, I hope, provocative questions. And, you know, when Jen was giving her talk about agroecology and food sovereignty, and she pointed out something which I'd never thought about before, which was that they work on multiple scales. So agroecology as a science and a practice really does work on multiple scales, and certainly food sovereignty acts politically and mobilizes on multiple scales, from the local to the global and whatnot. And so very much then the art then for food system change is how do we harmonize agroecology and food sovereignty on these multiple scales. And it turns out to be quite difficult. And why is it so difficult if these things are so compatible, and if in fact they have very much co-evolved? And I think that we have been asking, if we're trying to harmonize these things, but to what end? And I mean, it's not just the transformation of the food system. Yeah, okay, but wait a minute. The transformation of the food system into what kind of food system, and for whom? And who plays what role in doing all this? That's what we're grappling with. And I think that what we're not to create any binaries, but what we're really sort of engaging is, this imaginary, this very important imaginary, the utopias, which are all, as Galeano says, are always on the horizon. She keeps on moving. You take a step forward, she moves a little bit more. You take another step, she moves more. And that's what they're there for. Utopias are there for the movement. And political economy, because we have to understand who does what, who gets to keep what, and what do they do with it. And so I just want to look at food sovereignty it clearly comes from, its roots are in agrarian struggles. And not just in the global South, but as Monica has pointed out, in the South of this country. So food sovereignty really is agrarian-based. And it has come and been driven by people of color. And if we look at food justice, which is one way of describing a lot of what we're doing here in the US, the roots are very much in people's liberation movements in the global North. Black liberation, brown liberation. And I think certainly food justice then moves on, to civil rights and the war on poverty and all these things has different iterations. But if you go to the roots of food justice, they are sort of enmeshed with the roots of food sovereignty because they're both about liberation. But food sovereignty really has a very clear political critique of capitalist food systems, and particularly of neoliberalism. And therefore a very deep understanding of structural and class oppression. But food justice, I think, with its roots in people's liberation movements, people of color, has a critique and an understanding of the way oppression is racialized, and also how resistance is co-opted by the state, co-opted by the NGOization of social movements, for example. And so I think that the two movements are in the process of learning from each other. Issues of race and class, forms of resisting co-optation, forms of occupying the places and spaces of territory. And so I'm not too concerned, particularly in the United States, when we use one term or the other, as long as we understand that at the core, we're talking about liberation. Food sovereignty has driven so many people to realize that we have a capitalist food system, and so if we want to change it, we better understand what capitalism is. And I think the first notable agrarian characteristic of capitalism is that it appears with the great enclosures of the commons, of the peasant commons, the village commons. And so capitalism appears with the enclosures, with the destruction of the public sphere of the villages, of the tightly held village networks, which were very resilient and allowed people to survive under extremely different conditions. And of course, then drives them into the cities where they use them as cheap labor. But capitalism is resisted, and the enclosures are resisted bitterly over a couple of hundred years by the peasants, by the villagers, in what Karl Polanyi calls counter-movements. And these counter-movements were based on alliances, and they were based on class alliances against the emerging bourgeoisie. So you had some strange bedfellows, like you had peasants and aristocracy in alliance against the bourgeoisie. And I think that's very instructive, because these were tactical alliances against the enclosures in a desperate attempt to maintain the commons, because the commons was the basis for the resiliency of rural life. So with neoliberalism today, our latest iteration of capitalism, which Via Campesina is so recognized for resisting, neoliberalism ushers in which I believe, and some people believe, are the final enclosures of the commons. Our air, our water, nutrients, our diet, our thinking, everything is becoming privatized. And certainly along with this has come the destruction of the public sphere, just like before we had the destruction of the village sphere. And I think there's a couple things to read that are different and that we really need to take into consideration when we're considering our work in agroecology and in food sovereignty. That whereas the destruction of the commons and the emergence of capitalism and the great enclosures of the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries were permitted and were allowed and were driven by the Industrial Revolution, which could sop up all this labor. Today, we have no new Industrial Revolution to sop up all this labor. A third of humanity still lives in rural areas, and much of our resources are still held in common. But if we drive people, if we complete capitalist enclosures to their final solution, which is to drive everybody out of the countryside and into the cities, there is no new industrial revolution to sop up all this labor. We are condemning a third of humanity to misery and death. So people have to stay in the countryside. In other words, this trajectory that we're on with capitalism is completely unfeasible. There is no solution. It's not like it's the only solution. That is not the solution. So, but the countryside has to be made a good place to live. And I think that is precisely what this new counter-movement is about. I see agroecology as one of the tools in a counter-movement against neoliberalism. So if food sovereignty ushers in a counter-movement against neoliberalism, what it's really talking about is a movement against class supremacy. I would say food justice, the way I understand food justice, also as a counter-movement, but against the racialized impacts of neoliberalism. So it's against white supremacy, against male white supremacy in particular. And so this always comes up, you know, so what kind of reforms we want, or are we working for reform, are we working for transformation, are we looking for, are we trying to bridge, are we bridging, or are we simply preparing for social collapse? which is where we're headed. Capitalism probably won't fall, but society is rapidly heading for collapse. I think that to go back to the Black Panthers, what we're faced with is survival pending revolution, or if you like, survival pending transformation. And so that means that when we work for reforms, these need to be strategic reforms, which are transformative reforms. Because if there are reforms which help to hold this system in place, then we're doomed. But if there are reforms which allow us to transcend the system, then we have a chance. We don't know what's going to happen, but we might have a chance. I'm not optimistic. I'm very hopeful, but I'm not optimistic. So I think that dismantling white male privilege is very much a precondition for the type of convergence that we need in our movements to be able to create the political will to introduce the type of transformative reforms which can possibly save us. To be able to regrow the commons, to be able to scale agroecology, and actually materialize food sovereignty. Coming together, this sort of convergence in all our great diversity is more difficult than one thinks. If it was easy, we would have already done it. There are things standing in the way. And I would say one of the biggest things standing in the way is historical trauma. It's the historical trauma of oppression, and which has all kinds of sort of limbs and connections. And so we need to be able to heal from historical trauma. We need to be able to dismantle white privilege. We need to be able to get over the fear and the grief of white privilege, us white folks. People of color grappling with internalized oppression. We're all, in the end, grappling with oppression. We need to be there for each other. But, of course, it's not easy, because it's not just structural. Well, that would be hard enough. But it's also somatic. We've all been traumatized. And some of us are traumatized because we're the objects of oppression, and some of us are traumatized in a different way because we were the subjects, or are. And so I guess I want to say that dismantling racism in the food system, dismantling racism in the food movement, dismantling racism in our food organizations, and dismantling racism within ourselves is clearly not extra work. It is the work. It is the work of agroecology to dismantle racism. It is the work of food sovereignty to dismantle racism. And as long as we consider it extra work, then we're not going to be able to converge, and we're not going to be able to have the political power that we need in order to bring in the changes. So I'm beginning to be part of more and more of these kinds of gatherings. I know we call this a conference, and it is, but it's also a gathering. We're coming together because we're trying to sort this out. And I think this is actually very hopeful. And I think it's extremely hopeful because it's very clear that when we do this, what we're trying to do is use our privilege. If we're here today, we're privileged in some way. But we're trying to use our privilege to ally ourselves with those for whom giving up hope is not an option. So this is all pretty depressing stuff. And I say I'm not an optimist. You have to be an idiot to be an optimist. You have to be blind. Things don't look good. They look pretty bad. But most people don't have the luxury of giving up. And people who are most oppressed by the system are the ones who have the most hope, because they can't afford to give up hope. And so for us not to give up hope, it simply means to ally ourselves with those who can't give up hope. It's not an option, and they won't let us give up hope. So I think I want to end by, I guess, posing two questions, knowing who's here. So democracy has been tossed around a bit. And I just want to remind us that, the first democracies were slaveholding democracies. And then from there we move into capitalist democracies, the emergence of the nation state, and liberal democracies, which is what we have now. We held a vote tomorrow on our food system, fast food would win. So I think we really want to talk about, a much more radical form of democracy, which is not here yet, and which needs a certain set of social institutions in order to work, which we don't have yet. But I think that as we reestablish the commons where it's not like we all have, equal buying power, right, or equal rights. In the commons, we have equal power. Right. And then I think we can talk about radical democracy and democratizing the food system. And then for my fellow researchers, I was really moved by Dr. Taylor's presentation and just how it sort of blew up all of our assumptions around, supermarkets and food deserts and all that. Things a lot of us have been suspicious of for a while, but we haven't had any hard evidence to back up our suspicions and haven't had the time and the relationships to be able to go out and get the information. I think that in thinking more about it, there are these structured frameworks for research. And they're structured in the universities and they're structured in the capitalist system. This is a capitalist university, the capitalist food system. And so we have capitalist structures of inquiry. And so we begin to look at things in certain ways. And on top of that, we put the whole sort of layers of whiteness onto the way we do research and the way we get money for research and whatnot. So I think that if we are activist researchers, what we need to do is restructure these frameworks of research and engagement. And I think that's precisely what we're trying to do. And we've been invited, I believe, in a very provocative way by Dr. Taylor and others to co-construct these frameworks for research and engagement, for the transformation of our society. Thank you.
So now if we could have all the panel members and the discussants come up here and sit at these chairs. Make yourself visible. So we had a great series of talks. I'm sure everybody agrees. And at this point, I think we'll just, panel can settle down, please. We'll open it up to general discussion. First of all, does anybody in the panel want to say something in response to anybody else in the panel or any of the discussants? Okay. Anybody from the audience? Questions from the audience or comments?
He's tired.
Right here. Okay. I don't see it. Oh, go ahead.
I just want to thank each and every one of you. You touched on so many things that resonate with me deeply, so I appreciate you bringing your experience, your wisdom, and stuff that is just so needed in this discussion in this conference. Monica, I just wanted to ask real quickly, and anyone please jump in because it ties in a lot to what we've been discussing, at least during this part of the conference, and that is that symbiotic relationship between the academy and community. And, you know, when we talk about Black Lives Matter, what we forget to also think about is how Black knowledge matters, and how Black ideas matter, and how Black experiences matter. So what I want to know is, like, when we talk about neoliberal institutions, like the one that we're sitting in today, you know, how do we combat that? Because obviously certain knowledges are going to be validated more than others. And so, I mean, it's part of my work as an academic and an activist is always trying to deconstruct how those validated knowledges are always propped up, and because we're always being forced to produce you know, this using the type of discourses that we're given in the academy, you know, how do we blow that up? It's like, because that's what I'm here about. Because I do want to acknowledge the activists in the room, but I also want to acknowledge the activists in my work. And, you know, what price do we pay when we do that?
That's right.
You know, are we doing that and say, okay, I'm just going to give up the tenure clock because as someone who's been a contingent faculty member for 10 years, I know that price. But I want to know, how can we do this and make it so that we legitimize those forms of knowledges that are not being recognized?
Yes.
You really almost have to, like, I dare people not to tenure me. I dare them not to do certain things in the sense that the choices I make, for instance, how I go about studying things. As a black person, I cannot go into a community and do certain things that I see my white colleagues do and get away with it and get published and get grants on, because I have a responsibility. I don't say they. I don't write about communities as they versus us. I write about we, I, me, myself. And if you see yourself in it, just imagine if we took a bunch of black women into an upper white, middle-class community with tape measures to measure off their children and put them on a scale. They'd call the cops on us. Yet this stuff happens repeatedly in communities of color. And so just if you just flip that script of how absurd it would appear to communities if we do some of those things, but we see it done. So for instance, as Monica is doing, that historicity is very important. And I have an outcome, a book that I literally need to go back and get the proofs off to Duke University, where I talk about people like Harriet Tubman and how the understanding of foods and food system was so critical to the Underground Railroad and how she functioned with it and understanding that. So for us ourselves, it's also for us to value our own knowledges and experiences, because many of us don't know our history, or we disconnect that history from academia when we step in. I dare people not to take me seriously, and I'm always going to make that connection. Because if we can make that connection, we can then do Black Lives Matter in the sense of Black knowledge matters, Black intellectual thought matters, all those things matter. And in spaces like this, they really don't. They don't matter very much, but it's for us. And so I take that as a personal responsibility on myself to say, as a black academic, I don't care if I can get $300 million to do particular studies, or I can enhance my stature if I work with certain researchers, if they're doing certain things, working with communities in a certain way, talking, writing, thinking about communities in a certain way, I'm not going there with them. And I really don't care if they don't like me for not doing that. Doesn't matter.
I will. At a time when I was really trying to figure out where my work fit, I met Dorcita. She took me under her wing. She told me my voice was important, and helped me do what I needed to do, what I knew I was called to do. My attention was not on the academy. My attention was on the communities on whose shoulders I stand. So I wanted to make sure that the folks who I work with in Detroit saw a reflection of themselves and loved themselves in the midst of the work, in doing the work. So I will say that our presence is resistance. Our presence in these places, and it's not just, Dorcita wasn't just here at Michigan doing things at Michigan. Dorcita looked out for me and continues to, and so I think that there's this relationship where how we define resistance, how we uphold each other's work, how we make sure that the work of communities is central. And then people read my work and they're like, oh wow, this is brilliant. It's not my brilliance, it's the brilliance of the communities from whence I've come. So it's, and I don't have tenure yet. Dorcita has tenure, and so I think that, you know, that there's about, right? So I think that she, you know, is in a different place than I am. But I lucked up in a place that honors and respects the work that I do, and I'm not apologetic about it. I'm not going to apologize. And community is in my title, it's in my offer letter, it's in everything that I do. So if that was not, then I'd be okay with, you know, just sort of thinking about what else can happen, or what else I can do. So I do think that we have to value each other, we have to look out for each other, we also have to make sure that the community piece, the element is central, and our lens is critical in that. And there are people on the other side who are waiting and looking for us to come so that they can lend us a hand. We need to identify who our allies are and who those people are in positions of power in institutions, academic institutions, and we also have to be selective. All institutions ain't gonna love you. And maybe they're doing you a favor if you're not in those spaces. I know that from experience.
I just want to say that just as a set of suggestions really in taking your provocation about what that should be done, to suggest that one thing that I've sometimes noticed ask graduate students, how many of your graduate syllabi have people of color and women at the foundation? So instead of ordering them off like they were the founding fathers, white men, whatever your field was, we read all the quote classics, and then later in a term for 1 week or 2 weeks, you get to hear only some people's voices. So I asked other people about in what ways can we build in from the beginning in everything we're learning and teaching, not add-ons but foundational, to include diverse voices in the foundations of our scholarship. And I have other people I know also tried another strategy. I say this as practical politics, that if your university gives you even the slightest input onto what your personnel document looks like if they allow you to say anything like we promote people on X and Y, build in community involvement, community reports, community things. At universities where I've worked, we've had very good luck on rewarding people and fending off the people who say, well, if it's not X, Y, and Z, money or whatever famous journals, we're not tenuring you. But I think building in community, building in these things, building in those attachments can also be for allies saying, this is what we want this kind of thing, not give $1 billion and publication from famous press. But I think just in those two things, asking people what's foundational, what's central, what's critical, and making sure those things are built in so that there are bulwarks against anybody who, as you're pointing out, dares to or tries to defy what's important. This is political suggestion.
It's also putting funding into communities. Because many of us, as we go along, we have the opportunity to get funding. And for instance, so many U of M projects work in Detroit, yet they never fund a student from Detroit to come to the University of Michigan, put them on full funding to come here to be a part of it. The funding goes to some students from wherever, every place but Detroit. So that should be also part of the logic and the rationale, is so that we're putting money in several points in the system, and in that education it goes back to the Black Lives Matter, Black intellectual thought matter, Black scholarship matters. And I say to folks, we've had a lot of Black Lives Matter events on campus. I say, how many students have you in your time at U of M ever paid for, funded, who are students of color, who are African American, mentored? How many of those? And people don't connect the dots, that these are parts of what we're talking about. Because if we have students on these projects, trust me, we wouldn't come up with these incomplete ideas and these stereotypes, which there really are.
I think besides the funding, there's also the power around that, the decision making. And Eric talked about, we need new ways of doing things in new institutions. And I think we see all these promising examples that I'm challenge people to start making it work in your community or your university, in your neoliberal institution. People's movement assemblies, citizens juries, participatory budgeting. Demand that 1% of your university budget, the participatory budgeting process with staff, with the community. That's not something that's going to happen tomorrow, but that's something, one of those interim steps I think Andy referred to, what gets us from here to a really different system. And we know participatory budgeting happens, like it's around the world. The empowerment part doesn't always come with it. So you got to have that empowerment part where people speak their voice and that their decisions, that the money follows it. But that's one of those spaces where you have, I think, different kinds of conversations and you start valuing other voices. And I would say also another example that I find inspiring is the Foodinity project that Phil McMichael is part of. My friend Christine Porter, that's the PI for that, she does not go to any conference. She's an academic, she's a professor. Any conference that I've seen or heard her go to without a community member there that is also speaking, if not speaking instead of her. And she says, if you find yourself in front of a mic and you've been in front of a mic before, pass the mic. And I think that that project has actually been really, I mean, they've had troubles and struggles just like anything, but she and Phil and the other faculty, from what I've seen, hold themselves very accountable to their community partners. And really, the community partners set the direction of the project in a lot of ways, and they have challenged themselves to respond to it. So I think that's also an excellent model that we need to build on.
Yeah, I have a question for Peter. It was really exciting to hear about what's happening with the agroecology movement and with agroecology in particular within the movement. And I was wondering if you can comment on how you see the collaboration, the further collaboration with academia as well, in pushing this forward so that it's not co-opted by the corporations and the multinational institutions and all that.
I think we have, when I think about agroecology and the relationship between social movements and academia, I can think of a good model and a bad model. The good model, I think, is really represented by SOCLA that I mentioned, the Latin American Scientific Society for Latin America, because since its founding conference, which was only like 8 years ago in Colombia, they've gone at great pains to bring social movement activists and to have them be keynote speakers in front of all of the academics. And one of their conferences, I believe, in Brazil had 4,000 academics, but there were also 500 peasant farmers who were camping outside who all gave talks as though they were academics inside the conference. And they have made a real commitment, say, to supporting the peasant agroecology schools to help the self-analysis and evaluation processes of the Via Campesina organization. So that's a good model, like putting that academic knowledge at the service of social movements and giving social movements their right of place. But then there's a lot of other people in some of the more technical aspects of agroecology who I see right now rushing to sell their services to Monsanto and to all of these new privatizing interests in agroecology. And I see that, like the FAO scurrying to hide the social movement voice so that the US won't cancel their conferences. And so, it's definitely a dispute, and definitely academics have to take sides in the dispute. It's like, which side are you on? And I think now's the time. In the particular case of agroecology, now's the time to take sides. Different concepts or different movements have different moments, and I think this is the moment right now.
There's another, yes?
Hi, yeah, I guess I have sort of two comment question things. The first is, I think, Eric, you said something about capitalism won't fall and the society will collapse. And I kind of wanted to push back on that because I think if we actually kind of and I think we both agree, obviously, that capitalism needs to go, but I think we need to reframe it so that actually capitalism is this the unsustainable, sort of inhumane way of doing it, whereas society and people are creative and changing, and I think that it's actually, the destruction of maybe society will necessitate the destruction of capitalism, and kind of seeing that in a new way, and maybe your comments on that, any of you. The second thing is, climate change was definitely brought up in a variety of these discussions, but I wonder if I wasn't maybe sensing as much urgency as maybe I would have expected, and if any of you could comment on any of these movements and how they address climate change, or what is the discourse around it around food? Is it more mitigation? Is it adaptation? Is it preparation? Or, I mean, obviously, most farmers have to think about immediate, profits and feeding the table, but how are people grappling with, the kind of threats of climate change?
So that comment was meant to sort of punctuate the dilemma that we're in. And past sort of Marxist analyses of sort of classical and Marxist analysis and orthodox Marxist analyses of capitalism believed that capitalism would come to its logical conclusion, and then it would fall of its own weight, and then we would have socialism. And I think capitalism has disabused us of that. It has tremendous capacity to adapt, and it's very protean and always shape-shifting and changing. So now we're in a period of financialization, which no one imagined would, well, actually some people did imagine, where be so dominant as it is today. And so I think that unless, I guess what I was trying to say was that unless we have very powerful social movements to bring down capitalism, to transcend capitalism, and there's all kinds of debates about what that would look like and how much capitalism do you need and how much socialism do you need and do you need any of it at all, etc. But we know exactly what's going to happen. It's going to destroy much of the social and material basis for existence. But there will still be a power elite. There will very likely still be a power elite in a sort of I imagine it in a kind of a special uber-capitalized gated community protecting their interests while everybody else is in the hinterland scratching for an existence. So I don't think that's an unreasonable scenario. So the point just being that it's not going to just go away, we have to bring it down, and we have to transcend it.
I want to make a short comment about the role of the state, because it seems like from the conversations we've been having yesterday and today, to what extent do we need the state in order to achieve food sovereignty? And I think that having agroecology scale out is a great example of how we don't need the state, or at least, forming cooperatives, we don't really need the state in those instances. But I think that from the case study that I showed in Ecuador and in Brazil, it's, at some point we do need the state. And so, thinking about capitalism and the role of the state, how do we even think about transforming the system? And I don't know, Eric, if you can respond to that or anyone else, but that's something that I'm trying to grapple with as well in my own research, trying to think about to what extent do we really need the state in order to achieve, some principles of food sovereignty.
Folks, we are running a bit late. Sorry about that. So let's just take one or two more comments. Maybe we can make a Phil, you want to
Yeah, I'm trying to keep this short. I just want to thank the panel for incredibly thoughtful comments. And I have something that Annette passed on to me yesterday, and it really resonates with what Eric was saying about historical trauma. That really struck me as a really important issue. And Annette reminded me that La Via Campesina's position paper on food sovereignty back in 1996 stated, social peace, a prerequisite to food sovereignty. Everyone has the right to be free from violence. Food must not be used as a weapon. Increasing levels of poverty and marginalization in the countryside, along with the growing oppression of ethnic minorities and indigenous populations, aggravate situations of injustice and hopelessness. The increasing incidence of racism in the countryside, ongoing displacement, forced urbanization, and repression of peasants cannot be tolerated. Now, that's an incredibly insightful comment, and I think it also supports the idea that food sovereignty's roots go back way beyond 1996, and that they're very much historicized an understanding of the origins of food sovereignty.
Anybody want to respond to that? I wouldn't say right on.
Here, here. There was a question about climate change also.
Yeah, does anybody want to take the climate change thing on? Peter?
You should do that.
Via Campesina has made climate change one of its #1 priorities because farmers are amongst the first victims of climate change when planting dates become unpredictable, when there's a dry season in the middle of the rainy, drought in the middle of the rainy season, or a flood in the middle of the dry season, or the temperature changes and your crops no longer grow. Farmers are the direct and amongst the very first victims, along with coastal people when low water level rises. And then farmers have been doubly victimized by the false solutions to climate change put forth by the green capitalism complex, like agrofuel plantations and GMOs and RED Plus climate service payment schemes and all of that kind of stuff. But so on the one hand, farmers and peasants are doubly victimized, but on the other hand, farmers and peasants have the solutions, a lot of the solutions to climate change. For example, the diversity of peasant and indigenous people seeds gives us the genetic flexibility to respond to an unpredictable climate that the narrow genetic base of commercial seeds doesn't offer us, and so that's critical to the survival of humanity. And as some work by John Yvette and Newegg, and also by Grain and ETC Group, show that the industrialized globalized food system is responsible for anywhere from about 35 to 60% of global greenhouse gas emissions. That means that the food system, as it's currently constructed, where we're all eating food grown in another country, and the food that we grow we're sending to another country, is perhaps, along with with individualized transportation and contaminating industries in the north, is one of the major causes of climate change, or climate chaos. I love that somebody called it. That's a much better name. But food sovereignty is the exact opposite of that. So food sovereignty, in fact, is not only the solution to the food crisis, the solution to the rural crisis, the solution to generating local economic development, but it's the solution to reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the food system. So in Via Campesina, we like to say that we're both the victims of climate change, but we're also the solution to climate change.
I'll be very quick. I think the other element in terms of the urgency is we can't let urgency blind us to what actually needs to be done in terms of tactics. I mean, I think if we think about all the things that we're talking about here, there are a lot of urgent issues, and I mean the farmers, especially throughout the global south, but throughout many different classes throughout the world, have been seeing lots of forms of oppression and problems for years. So this is an exacerbation of existing situation. And if we're talking about urgency, I mean, what could be more urgent than the actions of the police in the United States, as well as many other countries, with Black Lives Matter, with the water shutoffs in Detroit? If we, who might be more on the climate or the food sovereignty side, aren't showing up in person at those fights, how could we expect them to also be concerned about other fights that we might, think is our main professional basis? So we got to be there for that. We can't let our urgency distract from those battles.
Okay, if there's no other we have come to the end. We would all like to thank all the panelists and the audience for staying on here and engaging in such productive conversations, or I think they were very productive. They were certainly productive for me. Thank you all, and have a great week.
What comes next?